Welcome, deer hunters, managers, and enthusiasts. This is Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. My name is Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. Bronson and I are professors of wildlife management and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. Together, we've researched deer across the United States for more than 40 years. In our podcasts, we explain the why and how of deer management based on science, whether it's research we've conducted or explaining research done elsewhere. We'll offer you a college course in the science of deer management.
But don't let Steve scare you. This isn't going to be a review of calculus or chemistry. Instead, we take results of research, reduce it to what's important, and explain how you can apply research to management. So join us for this episode of Deer University. Okay, welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I am delighted today to be with a friend and colleague down in South Texas. What county are we in?
We're in Maverick County, kind of on the edge of Maverick, close to Dimmitt County, between the towns of Eagle Pass and Carrizo Springs, not far from the Mexican border.
Adjacent, yeah, next to the Rio Grande River. So we are way down south and way down west. And today, the ultimate goal is we want to discuss culling, the impacts of culling, whether it works, whether it doesn't work. But before we go down that road, I want to introduce our listeners to Donnie Drager. So Donnie, why don't you give us just a little bit of a brief background of yourself, how you got in the business, how you got into this line of work you're in, your history, and then let's get to, before that, then we'll eventually get to the experiment at hand that we want to talk about. But let everybody know a little bit about you.
Okay, thank you. I guess I have an organic approach into this business, just like most of us. Started out hunting with my father and as early as I can remember, and that was the most interesting thing I had as a kid. I remember my high school years wanting to play safety for the Dallas Cowboys, and that kind of took care of itself, being relatively slow and not with no talent. So
when did you realize?
Pretty much sophomore year. Sophomore year.
So yeah. You lived the dream till you were 16.
I lived the dream. Yeah, the dream lasted till I was about 16, and then it became abundantly clear that you're not that big and not that fast. So and about that time, the reason I bring that up, about that time, my cousin married a guy who was going through his master's degree at Texas A&M. And he was working on ranches really not far from where we're sitting right now. And he was getting a master's in wildlife biology. And his name was Mark. And Mark and I met at a family reunion or, wedding or whatever it was. And we hit it off, and he invited me down. And I started spending my high school spring breaks and summers in South Texas working for him, and just became enamored with the business and immediately had this goal to shoot for. So I was one of those lucky people in life. Early on even in high school, I knew what I wanted. I knew what the end game was going to be, and that was I wanted to manage a ranch in South Texas and for white-tailed deer. So all my life kind of fell into place at that moment, and I worked to that end and worked very hard and did a lot of things that you were involved in our history, and you know those. And,
the highs and the lows.
Yeah, some great. Sometimes, now looking back on the lows, sometimes those become the highs.
That's
and
right.
It's really...
The lows are character building.
That's right,
yeah.
Without a doubt. So got a bachelor's from at Texas A&M, the big one, College Station, in range and wildlife. That would be wildlife ecology, and then went on to Texas A&M Kingsville under the direction of a very well-known man who and your major professor as well was Dr. Charles D. Young, highly respected, still so. And got a master's degree from Texas A&M Kingsville, working on a project on the Faith Ranch outside of Carrizo Springs with a guy named Rob Hall, who's quietly in the room right now.
In the audience.
Yeah, in the audience right now. And Rob and I...
keep him quiet, too.
Yeah, that'd be best. Yeah. So we worked on carrying capacity of white-tailed deer, and we did it in a unique way that we let the deer tell us through weight loss and these they were kind of semi-portable pens. It was a good bit to build them, but nonetheless, we did our graduate work on that. I got a master's in range and wildlife management at Texas A&M Kingsville. Graduated, started guiding for the Faith Ranch. Went to guide for the Sanctuary Ranch back in the early '90s, about mid '90s.
Where is that?
Sanctuary is in kind of middle or northern Michigan, not far, due west of Big Rapids, Michigan. Pretty well known. It was very well known in the late 80s and early 90s. It was one of those first premier destination whitetail commercial hunting places. Small acreage, big bucks, high intensity management. So I cut my teeth there early with a man named Skipper Bettis, who I also consider a mentor. He took me under his wing and showed me how they do things up there. That was very valuable. I moved from there to Arkansas for 2 years and actually managed flooded timber and became a duck guide for a few years. Then found my way back to Michigan, worked for Skipper again as the biologist for the Legends Ranch, also in Michigan, and kind of west of Big Rapids again, and worked there for 2 years, give or take. And then Charlie DeYoung, Dr. Charles DeYoung that we just talked about, was the head hunter for the place we are now, Comanche Ranch, and to find a biologist for him. So I got the short list on that and interviewed and
somehow didn't mess it up.
Somehow I didn't mess it up, and I really truly won the lottery in this business. I have a outstanding position, an outstanding family I work for. It's a phenomenal property, and work with good people in good locations, and I've been nothing but fortunate.
And you need to send Charlie DeYoung a thank you note at least once a week.
Yeah, I do. I see him
about 3 times.
Yeah, I do. I see him and have kept him. Ironically, I've employed him through the years since then, in a weird way, through research that we're going to talk about today. Yeah. He's been employed through us. So,
what can you tell us about the ranch? And keep in mind that even in South Texas, this is a unique place. But for people that have never been to Texas or South Texas, why don't you give people some idea of the enormous size and scale of this place?
Well, everybody knows that everything's bigger than Texas, and this is no exception. We are in the western South Texas. And western South Texas, it really kind of... we are in what they call the Golden Triangle. You know, people will know that. And that goes from Eagle Pass to, Eagle Pass to Cotulla down to Laredo. I believe that's the Golden Triangle if you look on a map. And then the Rio Grande River is the base of that triangle. And we're right on the northern edge of that. And it's a 113,000 acre ranch that where we're sitting right now.
Contiguous.
It's 107,000 contiguous, and then another 6,000 down on the river. It's not contiguous, but it's 6,000. We have 7 miles of riverfront on the Rio Grande. That's another 2 pastures that we manage as well and hunt. The uniqueness of this place is that it was in a foundation when the boss bought it for going on almost 30 years, since 1969, I believe, somewhere right in there. And it was leased for both cattle grazing and hunting, and it was run by lawyers and bankers in San Antonio, Texas, that were in charge of the foundation. And a lot of people said my boss was crazy for buying this place. They probably said they were crazy for hiring me too, but that's a different subject. But for buying this place, at the time, we were also in about a 4 or 5 year drought. The place was overhunted, overgrazed, and it didn't look good, you know. But my boss saw through that, saw potential, and when back then, people didn't talk about the resiliency of this rangeland down here. And they do now, and I think we're one of the examples of that, why people do talk about it. And through, 17 years of management now, or plus, we've become a pretty well-known ranch with some good success stories. So, and a key component of those years have been research that we're currently wrapping up. We'll talk about some of it today, I'm sure. So, and the other unique thing, South Texas, that western South Texas is just, it's really this one little blip on the radar of white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer are so adaptable, and they go from southern Mexico all the way to Canada, of course. Everybody knows Florida to California, and you can just... But this group right here, this little section of planet in southwest Texas has some really unique things about it, and we might get to that with the density dependent stuff that and we can talk about that. But and some of the research we did has really brought that to the surface, and it's changed the way we manage, it's changed the way we think about it, it's changed our philosophical view on whitetail. When it comes to right here, it doesn't necessarily spread outside of this area very much. Some things we've done are applicable, some are not, but it's so those are kind of the things that just pop in my head, if you will, when you talk about the uniqueness.
Well, the things that translate wherever you go is, number one, you keep your numbers in check. So
sure.
The habitat is not degraded.
Sure, that's a high priority for us.
Absolutely. And you manage for age structure.
Of course.
And
yes.
so that,
yeah.
So we've talked about this a lot in the past on the podcast, but I want them to hear it straight from you. What is the ideal for your management scenario? When are you harvesting bucks? At what age? We
like 7 years old and up. And you can ask me why, and I'll tell you, it's just the way we feel. And it's a little anecdotal on that 7-year number. If you look, and we have lots of data on deer that, where their peak, and we have the data, and then there's multiple other very large data sets from this region, South Texas, that tell you once a deer reaches 6 and beyond, let's 6 to 10, 6 to 12, whatever, however long he lives, it's really dependent upon that given rain year and the timing and how much of rain it has in that year on when they're going to peak. And we believe that data, but for some reason we have also anecdotally at least talked ourselves into, we like 7 years old and up. We've just seen enough of those cases that there's another jump. We give them not every deer, certainly not, but we give that deer another opportunity to make a little jump. And we're talking about, anomalies anyway. We're talking about deer that, from the perspective of the family that owns this place and the hunting that we do, if you're looking at the bell curve of Boone & Crockett scores, we're that far right 1% on the bell curve. So all that other 99% of deer, certainly we hunt and we have guests and they're important, but everything you can do to maximize that. So if it's 5% more antler growth on a deer that already scored 180, well, do the math on that. That becomes significant compared to 5% more antler growth on a deer that scores 120. Then relatively, right, you obviously get more inches out of that. So we just really try to maximize that. We'll I wouldn't say we break our own rules, but we're constantly evaluating that rule every deer. Some deer get 7 and we, hey, just don't feel it this year. We just looked like it was a down year for him for whatever reason. Who knows? We let him go. I'll do say that we rarely shoot a deer. Now that we've set that rule, and it's been many years that we've had that rule, we rarely shoot a deer that's 6 or younger. And it is, I think we'd categorize it as a mistake if it did happen. And we do have some very big deer in the 5 and 6 year old age class that if you looked at pictures and you think we're crazy for doing that. Just absolutely.
Oh, I do.
I know you do.
Yeah,
and you've seen these pictures. Yeah. You've seen the video. So you think we're crazy. And sometimes most of the time it pays off. A strong majority of the time. I don't have a number. I'd be making it up if I did, but a strong majority of the time it pays off. But I have an incident right now that is weighing heavily on my mind since August. I've got a deer that's 5 years old, and legitimately, I think he's over 200 inches, Boone & Crockett, and I haven't seen him since August. I've run cameras. I've done a helicopter survey over him, and I can't find him, or he's just a skull underneath the tree right now. And all of those scenarios literally break my heart because there's again, we go back to that bell curve and the anomaly and raising, all the right cards, all the scenarios have to play. Like good genetics, good nutrition, good rain year, both being born in a good rain year, both, all those things have to, we'll dive into those, but all those things have to play, all those dominoes have to be set up. And then for some thing that normally doesn't happen. Normally you lose a 5-year-old deer for whatever reason down here. Like I said, it's pretty rare. When it does happen to one of those deer, it stings. It is a kick in the gut, to say the least. Maybe even a little lower. Mm-hmm. So I'm that is weighing on my mind as we discuss this. But
Steve Damaris has the exact same story, different ranch, working with Bob Zaglin all those years, and they have that classic story as well. I don't remember the age that they decided to pass it, if it was 5 or 6, but similar scenario. So there's always risk.
Yes.
Anytime you're managing for mature, older age bucks, of course, there's always going to be the opportunity that they're going to die.
Yeah.
So.
The only heartful thing that I have, or at least we lean back on, is he was a 5-year-old. And we're pretty positive of that. We have pictures going way back. And I know that he would have got bigger. I mean, he was definitely still moving upwards. It's not like, he was 7 or 8 and we decided to give him one more year and then he just disappeared. Mm-hmm. This guy had room to grow. So it was the right thing to do from a maximizing antler potential perspective. So that's really how we base our decisions.
So let's be clear on this, Donnie, so there's no misunderstanding. You keep using these ages very definitively. He was 5 years old. I don't want someone to misunderstand and think you have a captive population you're talking about.
No.
This is 100% free range.
It is. We have, yes, it is. It's, and when I say that, I definitively use some ages. Some of these ages will be known ages from capture data that we're talking about, and the one I'm talking about in particular is. But the other time I may use that age, and I'm giving you my best guess without doing all these caveats of, we're wrong 25, 40, 50% of the time, whatever. And we all are, certainly. But
you may be.
Yeah, well, I think I'm being lenient on myself. I'm probably wrong more than that. But we go back, and we have an extensive camera and catalog system that we can keep backtracking that deer on, and we usually just try to find the first recognizable picture that we can find of a deer. And so he may have been unremarkable for the first 3 or 4 years of his life, but we might still have pictures of him. So we still work our way backwards, and once he's popped up and become remarkable, if you will, then there's probably some characteristics, those antler characteristics, that we can backtrack and we go, here he is. And you got 3 years of pictures, 4 years of pictures, whatever, or 2 or 1 or whatever. But you go back to the earliest picture you have, and our method is at that point, all right, let's all get together. And I have a team of guys that are all pretty darn good at this. Get together and we say, all right, what age is he right there at that earliest age? Mm-hmm. And that's where we kind of say from there. And we go, okay. In this picture, he looks like a 2-year-old. So everything just folds up from there. Mm-hmm. And that's when I'll kind of sound definitive. But the reality is that's a guess at a 2-year-old. It's an educated guess, but it's a guess.
Gotcha.
So we go from there. Then on the other hand, we have deer, because of the study that we're going to talk about, that have actually been captured, and they were captured as yearlings. Mm-hmm. And that's 100% accurate. You know, when you can look in their mouth as a yearling, see that 3-cuss premolar, then boom, you got it.
Especially the guy that's doing it.
The guy who's doing it, again, we go back to Charlie. No, more than that. Charles DeYoung has aged more live deer than anyone on the planet, and in the history of the planet, probably ever will. It's got to be close to. I would feel comfortable in saying 25,000 live deer, and I would bet it's probably closer to 30,000 or above. Mm-hmm. And over the years, he's done 2 or 3 really big studies of these with live deer. So doesn't mean he's right all the time, and I can prove that too through our data, but he's better than the rest of us, that's for sure.
Exactly. Okay, let's give people some sense of, before we get into the task at hand, the research project, productivity for this ranch. So you have this area, you're doing things right. The management you have prescribed all these years has resulted in what? On a given year, you're harvesting how many deer?
Really dependent, because we're not a commercial operation. We're a family-owned, family-hunted operation, and it's friends and family only, and it's a pretty tight group of people. It's not a big group of people that do it. And over the years, that number's gone down as the family becomes more selective on what they want to hunt. So any given year, we could shoot anywhere from 15 to 50 bucks, let's say. Pretty small, and then we used to do doe harvest, and we used to do more bucks harvest, and certainly we have a culling study that we're going to talk about that entailed a lot of buck harvest. But we've curtailed that from the things we've learned over the years, and both our research in deer density and as well as with culling. So as we get into that, you'll see why we have a very low harvest on such a large acreage.
But it's safe to say that over the years the family has harvested numerous Boone and Crockett bucks.
Oh yeah, I think we're. You're testing my memory, but I'm going to say we're right around. I think we're a little over 30 Boone and Crockett bucks in the last.
That's amazing.
15 years.
30 Boone and Crockett bucks.
Yeah.
Powerful.
Yes.
Management works.
It does, and yes.
All right, I'm going to take a sip.
Okay, sounds like a good idea.
Wet your whistle. Okay, now let's get into, we've already been talking for 20 minutes, by the way. So we've been talking about getting to the experiment, so let's get to the experiment.
Okay.
I guess a little bit of history. I'll let you talk about the experiment in, of course, greater detail. But this experiment was developed to address the notion of, and some research that had been done in the past showing what can be accomplished with selective harvest and culling, where you can manipulate the sire, and in a captive sense when you can manipulate the mother as well. And so remarkable, air quote, genetic progress can be made when you can affect both sides of that equation. You choose the mom, you know her history. You choose the dad, you know his history. And in a captive breeding sense like that, you can do what we see all the time now of producing yearling bucks that score 150 inches.
No, more like 250 inches or bigger. I mean, they're outstanding. They're amazing. And that's the breeding industry. And that is not what we do here. That is not what we're interested in. It's not, we're a free range, large ranch, and that's the way we want to keep it. But we were interested in producing bigger deer. And we hoped culling could be a vessel for that. So there's some research out of the hill country of Texas with, that showed that with Texas Parks and Wildlife that showed that that culling could work. And let me rephrase that. I think culling does work in a pen. It does work in a pen. So then, if you fast forward a considerable amount of time, some of that that research has been used as a reason to cull in the pasture. The pen research that shows culling could work is being used as a reason and justification to cull in the pasture. So, but without real evidence of what happens in the pasture. So the first person to really kind of tackle that was Mick Hellickson, and Dr. Mick Hellickson is a colleague of all of ours in this room, and friend. He did an experiment at the King Ranch, and real short version of it, about 8 years of culling 150 bucks on 9,500 acre treatment area, and showed no effect. All open range, all gun hunters shooting, showed no effect between the control and the treatment. They hypothesized that there was no effect because of immigration and emigration back and forth from the control and the treatment area. Dispersal, yeah, thank you. And so so we kind of grabbed the baton from there back in 2005, 2006 and said, all right, we can do that. We have some areas that have some high fence areas that we can control dispersal on, and we think we can do it even more efficiently. So we decided to somewhat replicate that study with a little bit, with the cooperation of Texas Parks and Wildlife in conjunction with them, and then bringing in Charlie DeYoung from Texas A&M Kingsville. We got a scientific permit from using both of those entities, and then we started in 2006. We started as what I like to call the most intensive culling project ever attempted on white-tailed deer.
I would agree with that.
Okay, and since then we went through 7 years of culling, and we won't have to go through all the details. We had 2 treatment areas. One was a moderate, where we didn't cull anything below 3 years old, and we culled 3 and up. The other one was intense, and we started culling at yearling, a year and a half old. And for example, it was intense for a reason. Those yearlings had to have 6 points or more to live as a yearling, to not be culled. And that became very intense. We'll get into those details. But the intensive area was 3,500 acres. The moderate area was 18,000 acres. Big country. And we'd use 3 helicopters. We'd had 8 days of capture every year. And we would fly around and capture deer randomly, bucks randomly, bring them to a central location. Charlie DeYoung would age them. We'd do all these metrics on them, from weight to mostly, weight, antler score, of course, Boone and Crockett score, take ear notch for DNA samples, take hair, take antler samples, all these things, right? And then we'd quickly let them go if they didn't meet the culling criteria. Or by that, I mean if they were bigger than whatever their age group was, they got let go. Bigger than the culling, they'd let go. If they didn't, they would be sacrificed, and then ultimately all that deer would be donated into town to worthy users. And then of course we had a control. Any good experiment has a control pasture. We had a 5,000 acre control pasture that all those things happened in: catch, measure. And then everything got let go.
But no culling.
No culling. Right. No culling there, of course. Everything got let go. So that was the control. And then we had 2 treatments. Again, a moderate one, 18,000 acres, and an intensive one, in 3,500 acres.
An intensive meaning because culling began at the yearling age?
Yeah, we culled 1 and 2 year olds in the intensive, and we didn't start culling till 3 years old in the moderate. And that made a huge difference, a really big difference in the big picture of things. When we set the criteria to 6 points or better to live, what that ended up doing is out of the yearlings we would catch over the 7 years of culling, we culled 94% of those yearlings. Now, certainly we didn't catch every single yearling every year. There's some that got away and just escaped the helicopter. It's not that. It is a very efficient method, but it's not 100% on a cohort every year. I always like to say that it took us about 3 years to get for lack of a better term, get our hands around a cohort. So by the time yearling, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, by the time that third age class, they were 3 years old going through that study, we'd really kind of we'd weeded out the lower quality antlered deer from the culling. So, but I don't know where to take it from there and how deep we dive into it. So I'll let you drive the ship a little bit more here, but that's kind of the basis of the study.
So, not to put you on the spot, 2 things I wanted to ask.
I thought that was the whole point of this, is to put me on the spot. Okay. But,
what proportion of the yearling cohort was 6 points or greater? You think that was less than 10%?
Well, yeah, it'd be 6% by what we caught. And we caught enough yearlings that I think you could certainly make that.
Okay.
I feel very comfortable saying that under the conditions we had. And let's back up a little bit. These aren't just your average deer trying to make a living in the rough South Texas rain with droughts and ups and downs. Certainly they're that, but they had supplemental feed and a very intense supplement. I mean, below like about a feeder to every 175 acres. And all the areas, both control, treatment 1, treatment 2, or let me rephrase that, control, moderate, and intensive, all supplementally fed at the exact same rate. Exact same feeders, exact same scenario for all.
Year-round?
Yes, year-round. Yeah, okay. Year-round. With some limitations during hunting season, but still available, put it that way. Even with that supplemental feed, under that criteria, you could see that, that spring rainfall and then overall rainfall. I'd say spring being foremost, and then the overall rainfall in a given year really drove the quality of antlers for all age classes, but it was extremely influential in those that 3-year-old and down, so 3, 2s, and 1. And so and if we had a great rain year, spring and summer, a lot more deer would get through the culling process without getting culled. They would be above it. Then on the other hand, if we had a drought year, man, there were many years in that 7-year period. South Texas, it's dry, so we had more droughts than we had good years. So there are many years that we'd kill 100% of the yearlings that came in, never let one go. Again, we didn't catch them all, but the ones that came in, we'd kill 100% of them. And, as a manager, it doesn't feel that good to do that. After a while, you start wondering what the hell you're doing.
Well, buck fawns are your currency here.
Yes.
I mean, that drives the system.
Yes.
And you're removing 90+% of them every single year.
Yeah, and then let's not forget that Mother Nature still has her toll. You still got to pay that toll. So the ones you may have missed and or let go still are subject to all the pitfalls that is living in South Texas, and that's again, droughts. Is it coyotes? Is it mountain lions? Is it just that yearling dispersal is stressful? All those things pile up. So we may have, what we got our hands on, called 94%, but then Mother Nature skimmed something off the top of that too. What that number is, I don't know, but I guarantee it's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, without a doubt. Okay, so why don't we... I don't know which to talk about first. I wrote a note. I want to get into the results, but I also want to, let's go with this, because it's very similar to what you're talking about. I jotted down a note, the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And so why don't we go with that? So you were at a level I think we can safely say hunters are never going to be as efficient as was demonstrated in this project with a helicopter, someone measuring the antlers, and someone aging the deer.
While it was still alive.
Alive.
And we still gave that
right.
deer the ability to let go. Yeah, absolutely.
But compared to doing this, like most people, with the hunter making often an instantaneous decision about the age of the buck and what the antlers are, and do I want to cull it, or, you're doing it at a level they could never replicate.
Without question. Yeah. I mean, and we did it at a level that was much greater. I mean, it was 2 to, depending on the treatment, but it was 2 to 4 times greater than even the King Ranch study. Mm-hmm. And they had full intention scientific study, hired guns to go out and get it done as hunters. And we were well above that. So there was a sense of purpose over there. And then you want to back down to your average hunter on the average hunting lease doing what they do. And nowhere near the intensity they could never achieve the intensity, nowhere near what we're doing. And that's really, we knew that going in the study, but we thought, let's just draw a line in the sand. We're going to do it to the nth degree. We're going to make no excuses in efficiency and or the culling intensity. And we're going to draw a line in the sand way up high up here, right? And we drew that line, and my thought was always, well, if culling works and it works at that level, then we can always backtrack into how your average hunter or average landowner can get into culling.
How they can implement it.
Right. On the other hand, the vice versa of that is that if it doesn't work at this level, then often early on I said, well, then let's just shut the door on this, because if it doesn't work with this, then
there's no management scenario where it can work.
Because this is really, truly a study that will never be replicated. Yeah. I mean, the amount of effort, time, money, people, acreage, it's just never going to be done again. So it's extremely unique. So.
Okay, so along those lines, because you are that efficient at removing so many, quote, low-quality bucks from a cohort, what was one of those unintended consequences that happened?
Well, in the intensive study, the intensive area, that 3,500 acres where we're going all the way down to yearling age class, what the unintended consequences were, there were multiple. First off, the big one is we started to really skew the buck-doe ratio to where we started at 1 to 1.5 or 1 to 1 to 2, right? Buck to doe. And we moved into, by the time the 7 years is over with, we were in 1 buck to about 6 or 7 does. And then what that also did, that is a reflection of what was really happening. And what was really happening is we were slowly exterminating the buck segment of the herd. We were, what I like to call, driving that buck herd into local extinction. Mm-hmm. And we did it strictly through culling, and mostly we did it by culling the yearling age class. It wasn't that we were so harsh on 4s and 5s and 6+ year olds. We were overly harsh on the yearlings. Now, a person who is a proponent of culling, and many were, who were part of this study and helped develop those criteria. Your audience is going, well, all I got to do is just back off a little bit. Let's go 4 points or 5 points or whatever, right? Well, the proponents to the culling said, well, the harsher you make it, the faster you'll make gains, right? If you only do 4 points and up, get to live, and 3 points and down, die, it's going to take too long and it won't work, and et cetera. So it's a circular argument, if you will. And well, it is now that we know what we know. But back then, it was, all right, let's make this bar pretty high, and then only the best of the best live. Those guys go out and breed like crazy, and they pass on their genes, and then the next generation is going to get a little bit better, and then we do the same thing to that generation, then it gets a little better, and then it gets a little better. So therefore, what you should see in this scenario, if culling worked under the conditions that we had, every yearling age class, every first-year antlers should score a little higher than the previous generation, or maybe not the previous cohort, the previous year, but the previous generation, 5 or 6 years, every 3 or 4 years. You should see a slow increase. Mm-hmm. We did not see that, and at the same time, we were running out of bucks, and it was actually you running the statistical analysis at year 7 that alerted us. We knew it on the ground, but you said, this is unsustainable, I think is the word you used. Right?
3 more years of this and they will be extinct.
Yes, exactly. So we thought it was prudent, both from a ethical standpoint and from a management ethics and experimental wise, that all right, what we also knew at that point, as you pointed out, is that we had changed. We're going to use this word, and we're going to use it a couple times, a standing crop. Mm-hmm. And I'll explain to the audience. Standing crop is what's out there right now. If you could snap your fingers and say, all right, I want to measure every antler score of every buck that's on my property right now, live and on the hoof, right? Then I would come up with an average for this scenario, average for all deer 5 years old and up, right? Average Boone and Crockett score. Well, that's what we did. We took that from our capture data. We averaged we knew that we had an average about I think it was around 130 to begin with for 5 years old and up deer, a standing crop that were alive at that moment. And year one.
Average B and C score of mature bucks.
Yes.
At that time.
Yeah, in the beginning.
130.
In the beginning. By 7 years later, we'd moved that to around. Actually, you know what? We'd moved that around to 140-ish. It's above 140. And meanwhile, the control stayed the same, and hence it's the control. It was around 122 that year, so I think we went the year we stopped. So it was about 18-inch difference. That's a significant difference. Mm-hmm. We had improved the standing crop, therefore achieved our culling. What the initial goal of culling is to get rid of all the lower quality bucks, improve the standing crop, and then you let those guys pass on. Now, let's be clear to the audience as well. An average of 140 means that there are deer inside that average that are 170, 180.
And 100.
Yeah, I don't know if they were that low, but yeah, I bet you're right. I bet you could find them in that data set that low. But, so you're averaging, and it's a big data set. This data set that we're talking about, we just finished up Thursday, the last capture, right? And that's why we're doing this podcast. We had just about 20 deer shy of 11,000 lines of data in our matrix or our data set. So 13 years of capture is what we're talking about. I don't know that we mentioned that yet. It's intense. It was hard work. But so back to standing crop, we've achieved it. We've made a better sire or superior sire, and I am using air quotes there, right? Mm-hmm. So in theory, that means all those guys get to breed the does that are left, and there's a lot more does per buck than there was because we killed so many bucks. So in theory, like, all right, this could happen now. We got all these superior bucks breeding. The next generation or the next cohort, several cohorts should just keep getting better. Well, we didn't see that, and there's some multiple reasons why we didn't see that either. And it all comes down to we created a negative feedback loop, and by that, I'm going to circle back here. So we know that we spread the buck-doe ratio out from originally 1 to, let's say, 1.5 to 1 to 6. And the unintended consequences that you're talking about that happened with that is there were not, and we shot so many or removed so many bucks that there weren't enough bucks to actually breed all the does on the first estrus cycle. Therefore, a certain percentage of does every year would move to their second estrus cycle and then get bred. That created what is a pretty well-coined phrase, late-born fawns. Mm-hmm. I don't know in the Southeast that you have to talk about that very mm-hmm. often, but
yeah, we do.
Okay, mm-hmm. So a late-born fawn as your audience may know, that it is he's got some strikes against him.
The odds are against him.
Yeah, he doesn't have as much time to get all that. First off, he doesn't get the tail end of that green spring flush. He doesn't get as much time before the winter comes. He doesn't get as much time before his antlers harden, et cetera, right? So that more times than not, on average, a late-born fawn is smaller in antler size, usually smaller in stature too, body-wise. So we've created a system that, and then, okay, well, let me continue with the negative feedback loop. Now we have a significant portion of late-born fawns. Now you move those back to the next year's capture when those late-born fawns get their first real set of antlers at yearlings, and they were behind the age curve. They're late-born, so they didn't get the chance to produce the antlers that maybe their genes said they didn't get to express it properly because their mother had them late. So now, and what does that mean? Well, that means they didn't make they got culled.
Higher probability of being culled.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so that completes the loop, if you will, of the negative feedback loop. So we were never going, it became very clear, especially through your statistical analysis to us in that 7th year, that you're never getting out of this. Mm-hmm. This is just going to continue. You'll never get out of this. And that in itself is telling about the genetics of white-tailed deer. Because if they were easily manipulated by just manipulating the sire, the male segment of the herd, if they were easily manipulated into bigger antlers, we wouldn't have never seen that that negative feedback loop. The late-born fawns would have been so superior genetically that it didn't matter if they're late. They would have grown bigger antlers than the control pasture would have, let's say, just being normal timing fawns. We didn't see that, so it's telling on several levels. But that negative feedback loop was, really an epiphany for me on how it just was going to feed on itself forever. And so we had to make a call. We stopped culling after year 7 on both the intensive and the moderate area. And then since then, year 7 to this year's year 13, all we've done is kind of treat everything like the control pasture. We catch randomly, we measure everything that we can measure, all the same metrics, and then we let everything go. And the thought behind that is that that if those fawns were born late, they might, and you don't kill them, they're yearling or 2-year-old, they might have a chance to express their, quote, again, air quotes, superior genetics later in life. There is a temporary environmental factor, right?
But can they compensate and catch up?
Yes, that's the question. We didn't know that. We didn't know that at that moment. Can they catch up? Let's say the year 3, 4, whatever. So let's just keep catching. Let's just keep measuring everybody. We're certainly going to be watching those cohorts, those younger cohorts that got sired by the quote unquote superior genetics. Then let's keep an eye on that. We did that. And the short version of the story is they were no different than the cohorts previous to culling or in the early stages of culling. They had all the ups and downs of the wide standard deviations of any cohort. There were some big ones in there. There's some small ones, and they averaged about the same as the moderate or the treatment. And so that's kind of the nutshell of what happened in that study right there.
So this always begs the question is, we know antlers are genetically controlled to some extent. Genetics plays a role. Genetics are part of the equation. So why doesn't this work?
Well, the short version of that is genetics don't play a big enough role, or they're outweighed, however you want to say that. Through the DNA research and through some really smart people, Dr. Randy DeYoung, PhD student Masa Honeisho, these guys that work with us, they really did the DNA stuff. And what they found is the genetics, even on the older deer, let's call it 3 and up, were there. The reason a buck's antlers looked the way it did at 3 years old and up, you could explain it by 45% of that could be explained through genetics of its father, its sire. That means 55% of what a deer's antler looks like when it's 3 years old and older has nothing to do with the dad. There's nothing. There's permanent environmental effects. There's unknowns. There's all these other things that are in the pie chart, right?
Yeah.
Right. That's one way to put it. The other, probably more simplistic way to put it, is that the environment outweighs genetics, especially in South Texas. And so, I use the word all the time. Stochastic is the perfect way to
random,
stochastic. Big swings, however you want to say it. You want to sound smart or whatever. I like to sound smart.
You try to.
I have a thesaurus. I look at it once a week. I pull out these words.
Yeah.
Stochastic was one. It's a little on my calendar. I'm not even sure I'm saying it right. But anyway, the environment swings greatly with rainfall down here. So you can have these wet years that are 35 inches of rain in a year. And then you'll have years like 2011 where you get 8 inches of rain. It's crazy. And that is highly impactful. So whatever genetics a buck inherited from his father, the environment will outweigh it. Now, if it's a good year, a great year, then that buck probably fully gets to express his genetics that his father gave him. On the other hand, if it's, and let's say that genetic pushes him to 130 inches that year, or 200 inches, or whatever metric that is, but on the other hand, you take that exact same deer and put him in a different rain year. I'm not saying, I'm saying, 2 consecutive timelines going next to each other here, and give that deer a bad rain year, bad luck, if you will. He's not going to even reach his genetic potential. He may be a 130 when his genetic says he could be a 200, or he may be 100 when his genetic says he could be a 130. He just can't get there because the environment is more, the environment determines antler expression more than genetics. And that's a big deal that we found here. And I don't know that you can overstate it, how important it is, at least to South Texas.
I guess I use the word suppress a lot.
Sure.
You have the genes to code for a particular antler size, configuration, etc., but the environment is either going to augment that expression or suppress it.
Yeah.
And in more years than not, here, it's being suppressed.
Certainly. Yeah, like you get one good year, let's call it 2 out of every 10 years. Yeah. Let's call it the
amazing.
Average. Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about, and so I hope I have this right. This is always the way I've thought about it, and so I hope it's accurate. But heritability is kind of a population scale metric for the proportion of, in this case, antlers that can be explained by genetics.
Sure.
We always say, depending on the year, 30%, 40%, etc. But something Randy and Massa did with your population here is the breeding value, which I tend to think of heritability as the population scale average, and breeding value is assigned to an individual buck.
I think that's a good way to think about it. And breeding value is first off, it's the first wild deer herd that's ever had breeding values calculated for it because of the sheer number of captures we had, and we collected DNA on all of it. So let's back up and let's talk about how we got to how we determine breeding value, right? So we catch a deer, it gets an ear notch. Just take a little piece of their ear out, and that DNA then goes into a lab of super smart guys of Randy and Massa, and they do their magic, right? And these giant matrices, and it gets banked, if you will, in a matrix, and over time we keep collecting more and more DNA, and then we can tell, this guy is sired that guy, and so forth and so on, or this guy is a cousin to this one, or a brother, or a half-brother, et cetera, et cetera. So they just keep banking and banking. Over time, you get enough of those relationships that you can run this analysis or matrix that they do, and then we come up with any given buck that has enough relationships out there can be calculated a breeding value. And breeding value is really just a measure of how good the buck in question, in this case, how good is its offspring going to be relative to the rest of its cohort, relative to all the other bucks that were born the same year. So a good way to think about breeding value is sort of an XY axis, where in the middle, halfway up and down the y-axis, halfway up that is a 0. And then you have negative numbers below it and positive numbers above it. And they've actually even coordinated this to Boone-Crockett score. So if a buck has a 0 breeding value, and that means on average, that's again another one on air quotes, that buck's offspring will be exactly average for that year's cohort, right? The rest of the bucks that are born with him. Then let's say he's got a negative breeding value. Let's say let's call it negative 10. Let's call it negative 10. That means in this case, the way they've done this measurement is that on average, his offspring is going to be 10 inches below the average in Boone-Crockett score for the rest of the bucks born. And then again, vice versa, you can go up to 20 plus whatever. If you got 20 plus, he's 20 plus inches bigger. So those are the ones you want. Obviously, those guys way up in the positive numbers. So those guys calculated that. And it's an extremely powerful tool. And again, never been done on a wild deer herd. It's the best way. It's really difficult for me to try to. I want your audience to try to conceptualize this, but it's a scatter plot that goes upward and to the right, with a whole bunch of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dots on it, right? An XY axis, and that shows you there's a loose relationship of large antler bucks being able to pass on good genetics. On the other hand, the relationship is so loose that you could never draw a line anywhere and say, we're only going to keep deer above this level. Because whatever line you draw and say, deer that score above 165, we're going to keep those and cull everything else, right? And if you did that, you may have a cluster of deer at that line that are above 165 that are like 15 deer, let's say. I'm just kind of making this up, but just for purposes. 15 deer above the line, above the 0 breeding value line that are all positives. But below that breeding value, you probably have 10 or 12 below that too. So it's not a strong enough correlation that would actually work, is my point. Right. So hopefully I explained that well enough.
Yeah, I think so. I guess where the rubber meets the road is that it's like we often joke about with culling. Wouldn't it be fantastic if the doe had some indicator that she's going to have sons with large antlers, but that doesn't exist, obviously.
No.
The same can be said. You can see this buck, this potential sire, he has large antlers or he does not, but there's no indicator whether his breeding value is going to be high.
Right. So that's a great way to put it. And it really blown the mind of some people when I've given talks. I have pictures of a buck that I have pictures of two bucks beside each other in these talks. And I say, who would you rather sire the next generation? This buck that scores 125 as a 6-year-old, or this buck that scores 160 as a 3-year-old? Well, of course, everybody's, well, I'll take the 160 as my breeder. Well, yeah. Well, and then I do the magic reveal, and guess what? The 125 6-year-old is the father of the 160 3-year-old. Mm-hmm. And you're like, whoa, how
can that be?
And then I can show a slide doing the exact opposite, where you've got this 180 class buck, and he's awesome. Look at this. Or would you rather have a 140 or 130? I think it was the two bucks there. It's a 130 class. They're both 6 years old. Which one would you rather have as a sire? Of course, everybody picks the 180. And when you do, if you did that in that case, that 180 had a breeding value of negative 14. His bucks were 14 inches below the average. Not 14 inches below 180, what he was. 14 inches below the average of the cohort, which in South Texas on average bounces around 130. So that means a 180 class buck, on average, his offspring was going to score around the 15 mark, right? So that's not very good. And not the buck that you want siring.
Right.
Your next generation. So my point is, and one of the things I end with when I do this talk is that breeding value does not equal, antler size does not equal breeding value. Mm-hmm. That you cannot look at a buck's antlers and say that, oh yeah, he is a, some people use this term too, and just outside of the pen, well, he's a breeder buck, we're going to let him live a few years, we want him breeding all the does, blah, 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 right? Well, you don't, that's all fine and dandy, but you have no idea what his breeding value is. None. And therefore, you have no idea what he's really passing on to the next offspring. So the example you gave is perfect, and I use that same thing. I asked the audience, okay, how do you tell if a doe has good antler genetics to pass on to the next generation? You can't. The answer is you can't tell. And then my immediate response after explaining all this is, guess what? You can't tell in bucks either.
Yeah.
So, and it's really disheartening. Mm-hmm. My wife was in the audience this summer at a talk in Texas in San Antonio, and this guy sitting next to her, very interested, very attentive, and didn't know that she was my wife. So I get done with all this, and I go through this breeding value, and you can't tell, blah, blah, blah. And he just leans over completely, poor guy, completely distraught, understands it, but distraught. And he just looks at it, just hands open to the sky and outward, and goes, well, so what do we do? What do we do? And that, you know what? That's a great question. Mm-hmm. And I think we ought to go into that. What do we do if we can't determine what a good buck is and what a bad buck is as far as who's going to breed the next generation?
We do exactly where we started. You manage for buck age structure. You manage for nutrition.
Right.
That's what you do. And you can't do any of this other stuff.
Well,
you can do it, but it's not effective.
Well, yeah, you can do all you want. Yeah, that's right. And I think what it does is it reinforces what you just said. It says that for us, after killing 1,333 bucks in 7 years, I mean, that's what was culled.
Yeah.
It was a significant number. The moderate pasture, 18,000 acres, had 908 bucks killed in 7 years. The 3,500 acre intensive pasture had, I think it was 350 something, right? Mm-hmm. So on 3,500 acres in 7 years, it's hence unsustainable. So after doing all that and reducing this buck population on both areas, we're primarily bow hunters here. We really started to appreciate what I like to call the intrinsic value of a mature deer. And so that goes back to what you just said, the age structure. There is something really rewarding about sitting in a bow blind and having a 7, 8, 9-year-old, 225-pound mature whitetail come out. Does he have 8 points? Does he have 10, 12, 15? Who cares? Right. I mean, at some level, right? Mm-hmm. Sure, I have to care. It is my job, of course. But there is something really rewarding about that. And we took that aspect away from ourselves by this project, and we're slowly getting it back now, and we appreciate it more now. You know, they say you don't appreciate things till you lose them, and that's true with us. Mm-hmm. We really do appreciate that more now than we did then. Having this big old fat, mature, looked like a 55-gallon drum with little short legs jump in and start eating and feed in front of you, and you're just like, oh, this is awesome, right? So that's a big deal. So, and you hit it. That's exactly right. Concentrate on the things you can control. Work towards those age structures. And the other thing, it's a little liberating knowing this as a deer manager.
I can see that.
It's liberating in the sense that one deer will never screw up your deer herd. Mm-hmm. And that goes both ways. If you let this deer live to breed more does, it's really probably not going to change it will not change the direction, not probably to it. It's not going to change the direction of your deer herd genetically, and it will not affect whether you have more trophies in the long run, probably. Not probably, it won't. Mm-hmm. The same is true if you've got this old knobby-headed cull out there for whatever reason you don't like the way he looks, and you can't get him killed. Guess what? That's not going to hurt your deer herd either. You. What does hurt your deer herd is overpopulation, poor habitat management. That'll drive everybody down. Absolutely. And what will drive and high tide rises all ships will be available nutrition, via habitat management, supplement, age structure, all those things. So yes.
Donnie, I was looking at your slides the other day, and you had some pretty cool information. Basically, I think you titled it "Switching States," which basically meant that for all these age classes, you had bucks that in one year they would be the status of being culled, but in another year they may be under the status of not being culled. Can you go into that a little bit? Yes.
That's a good setup for it. So let's take the culls, I guess, first. If you took the yearling, the year and a half old age class, and I have to turn around and look at my computer to see the exact number, but it is. So we have them as culls, and in this case, it would be 5 points and down. That how many of those, by the time they turn 2, would be considered a trophy? And in this case, would be they'd have to have 8 points or more. Right? So there's your exact metrics. And what happened over these years of watching these deer move from one age group to the other is we saw about, I want to say it was around 70% of those deer, those yearlings that were culled, could be culled, let me rephrase that, a cull 1 year would be moved to a trophy the next. And that number slowly goes down as they get 4 or 5, older in the age classes. It starts, but even by the time they're 4 years old, it's still like 25% could move from cull to trophy. So the take-home message there is you may be looking at what you consider a cull today. But again, why? And it very well could switch to what you may consider a trophy in that age class the next year. Why does it do that? Well, that goes back to the environment. It may have gotten the bad luck that 1 year and gone down, the environment suppressing, if you will, those antler expressions, fully expressing those antler genes, and therefore it got pushed into the cull. And let's remember, culling and trophy is this human line, this somewhat random line that we just draw.
Inferior and superior.
Yeah, all these terminologies and these, your line is over here, mine line's there. It's just, kind of comes down to a bunch of BS. So you have to remember that. So everybody's a little different. So I'm trying to make it with the true metrics we did. But anyway, they switch dramatically. And from a cull to a trophy started that. A lot of those deer switched. A majority of them did, frankly, from cull to trophy. The younger they were, 1, 2, 3-year-old age class, and then it started waning down the older you get. By the time you're 5, 6, then it's 10, 15, 12%, something like that. So they're mostly staying in that same category. On the other hand, how many switch from trophy to a cull was really interesting. You'd think it'd kind of have the same line, kind of downward trend. It was 30% across the board. Didn't matter what age. So if you had a outstanding trophy, say you had a 7-point yearling, right? Mm-hmm. That's a trophy by or an 8-point yearling. Trophy by anyone's standards, right? 30% of your yearlings are going to move to of trophy yearlings are going to move to a cull status. 30%, and it goes all the way across the board, all the way down to 6-year-olds and plus. That 30% of them are going to switch back and forth. To me, that's a really kind of it's an interesting number because it's so steady across them. It bounces to 28, 32, but let's just average it.
Yeah, 30.
Across, right? So, to me, it's a really interesting metric that, well, why is that so steady and the other one kind of moves around? I got to put some brain power to that over time and probably...
You may need help.
Yeah, I think, I know I'm going to. Well done. But I think that also, that trophy to cull kind of shows a little something about the environment too. It really kind of shows you that guy who bumped above the trophy status, whatever that random line that you put in the paper is, it has moved below it, and it very well could do something with the environment.
Can you give, I'm trying to think of maybe some details we haven't gone over. I think you covered the intensive treatment very, very well. Your number was 94%. 94% over time were culled.
The yearlings.
Of
just
the yearlings.
Yes, just the yearlings.
Right, of the yearlings. Can you go into a little more detail in the moderate treatment? Culling began at 3.5, but what was being, quote, culled and what was trophy status or cull status?
Once we hit 3 years old, then both treatments, intensive and moderate, were culled exactly the same way. The criteria were the same way from 3 up, right? The only difference is the intensive had 1 and 2 year olds. So 3 years old and up, they had to have 9 points or more to live. And 4 years old, I think, was the exact same. 3 and 4 year olds, they had to have 9 points or more. And then when we hit 5, it was a Boone-Crockett score. So they had to be above above 145 as a Boone-Crockett score as a 5-year-old to live. So it was 144 and 7/8. Well, as a 5-year-old, he didn't make the team, So that's the criteria, and that was both of them. But the interesting thing about the moderate pasture, again, 18,000 acres, we flew that pasture 6 days a year with 3 helicopters flying, 2 catch helicopters, 1 transport helicopter, lots of people, lots of eyes looking, lots of effort. And at the end of how we talked about the standing crop and the intensive pasture, that we changed it from up to 140 and compared to the 122. The fascinating thing to me about the moderate pasture is that we didn't even change the standing crop. The standing crop was exactly or roughly the same as when we began and roughly the same as the control pasture. I still have trouble getting my head around that because as a hunter and a manager on this property, I spent a lot of time in those blinds and looking and driving and seeing these deer. And we talked about how you take an ear notch. You sit in these blinds and it felt like a vast majority of the deer that would show, or the bucks that would show up, had ear notches. So you're like, man, we really got a handle. Yeah. We got our hands around this deer herd, and we got a control on them. But the data shows otherwise, and I've always said there's no substitute for empirical evidence. So what you think is happening out there can be very, very misleading. And I have a saying, one of my sayings that I like to use when it comes to culling and why people cull and why they continue to cull is if I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it.
One of my favorite lines too.
Thank
Absolutely.
you. And that refers to the idea of people so desperately believing or wanting to believe that culling works, that whatever product is happening on their ranch or their piece of property is inherently whatever good product or productivity is happening is inherently attributed to culling. Meanwhile, they're probably doing this whole menagerie of good things. Mm-hmm. Habitat work, they're probably getting their age structure. If you've invested in culling, you're probably investing in these other things.
Right.
It could be supplemental feed, it could be food plots, it could be oak trees, it could be all these things.
Fire.
Age structure, fire, and then age structure, getting it older and older. And and you ask them, hey, what's working on your place? And they go, oh man, we've been culling for 5-6 years now. Man, you can really tell a difference. You're like, really? That's great. Do you have a control pasture? Do you have a control area where you don't cull? Yeah. Do you have a control area where you don't cull? No, I don't. Why? And so it's. I have a.
And here's the other part of that, Donnie.
Okay.
We've joked about before, and someone could look at your data, and it would be manifested like this: Donnie, look at this age class. What are you telling me? Your 4-year-olds score whatever 150 inches now.
Yeah.
Culling is obviously working.
Right.
But
has to.
That's the standing crop. That's because you killed everything else but the good ones.
That's right.
There's no genetic transformation going on here.
Yeah, if you kill everybody under 6 feet tall, the population looks really tall.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
That's how that works. So that's it is and that is the confusing part to the layperson. Mm-hmm. It is really hard to take the leap from standing crop, that what you see with your own eyeballs. Again, if I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. What you see with your own eyeballs out there to what is really the mechanism of how you got there. Mm-hmm. And how you got there was you culled everything on the low end and it all looks big, exactly what you're saying. So I try to really stress that when I give these talks because I think it's a huge, huge point for take home. And to the point that I'm probably a little overly blunt on the control pasture thing. If you don't have a control pasture, you have no leg to stand on when it comes to this subject. Don't talk to me about culling unless you've got a control pasture. Mm-hmm. Because I could show you the data of the 2 treatment areas if you follow it over time. The average Boone-Crockett score of even like yearlings or 2-year-olds or 3-year-olds. I can pick a segment of that out. And not show you the control pasture. I'm not going to show you the control pasture right now. I'm just going to show you the 2 treatment areas. Pre-culling and post-culling, right? Well, I've got average Boone-Crockett score, let's say 3-year-olds are 112 or whatever, I don't know. And then post-culling, they're 125. Holy moly, 12, 14 inches gain, right?
It works.
Oh my God, culling works, right? Well, then you magically pop in the control area in that same graph. And the control is even on the pre and the post.
Yep.
Well, that just tells you that, this had nothing to do with control. I mean, with the culling, it had something to do, again, we go back to the environment. Mm-hmm. So high tide raises all ships. Those post-culling years that we happen to be measuring, those metrics in those years were good rainfall years.
Yeah.
So it raised all the ships. Everybody's scores
Everybody got bigger.
Everybody got bigger. But when you don't have that control in your data set, or you're just doing this ad hoc on your own lease or property, or your brain doesn't factor that in. And it's not anybody's fault. I mean, it's human nature to do that. And it's also human nature to believe that activity gives you productivity. And culling is a very it's very active and very, you get a warm fuzzy, if you will, from cullings. For some reason, humans really are attracted to that.
That's exactly where I was going to go next with you, was getting into the psychology, and we're not psychologists, so we really can't, but...
No, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn last night, so I've got that going for me.
Nice.
Okay.
Why does this persist? There's all this evidence.
That's a great question.
But I think it's pulling the trigger.
I think so. When it comes down to it, we're hunters. And the end product of hunting is to kill. So when you give someone this excuse to kill, mm-hmm. Inherently it becomes an attractive option. Feral hogs are prevalent for a lot of reasons. One reason they're prevalent, and my theory is why they're still migrating beyond states and boundaries that we didn't think they would, is because they're fun to shoot.
People love to hunt them.
They're fun to shoot. Yep. They don't taste too bad either. They're pretty darn good. So the idea of exterminating something that's fun to do is kind of a tough sell. Mm-hmm. So I think you bring that back to culling. The idea of telling me that I don't get to shoot things is not that attractive. So I'm not a popular speaker in that sense. When I go and talk to an audience, they do not leave my talks with this cheery, rosy, warm, fuzzy feeling. More often than not, probably why I never get invited back anywhere.
You get one invitation.
I get one invitation. There's a whole multitude of reasons for that one invitation and never getting a return. But this is one that I like to lean on, is that I don't get, the audience comes up to me often and they're just like that guy that's sitting next to my wife, is that they're distraught, they're confused. What do? I have to do something, don't I? And it is, it's hard to channel that energy back into, go get a food plot. Go plant oaks and wait 12 years.
Right.
You're like, it's
light a fire.
Light a fire. Well, in your area, yes. Yeah. My area, hey, go invest in supplemental feed.
Yeah.
Do these things. Go get brushwork. Let them get older. There's a thought. Don't shoot them.
You think the same, Donnie?
And here's the other, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the other thing is a pet peeve of mine. You've got me on a roll here, so I apologize. But the idea that I'm going to call a yearling buck that is a spike, that I'm going to call, and now we're getting into borderline religious territory in Texas.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. The spike buck. So, but let's say the idea that I'm going to call a spike buck when he's yearling, his first year's antlers, I'm going to call him now for genetic improvement, and I'm going to make my herd better. Meanwhile, you ask that exact same, hey, what's the biggest buck you ever killed? What kind of buck do you want roaming your land? Oh man, if I could ever kill a 120 class or 115 or 130, if I could just get to that point, if I could just get there, and that's you go, well, guess what? If you just didn't shoot that spike, the odds are he could get right in that category. Mm-hmm. That's him. And so all you're doing is removing opportunities later in life.
Yep.
Look, we promised we wouldn't go into the political side of this, but there's a lot of blame to go around for this being a prevalent idea in our industry and got pushed down to the hunter at a level that he has, and I don't want to offend anybody, but he has no reason to be culling. None. There's so many other things to concentrate on that would give you productivity, give you bigger deer, and give you more deer. And that you should never even mention the word culling, shouldn't even be in there. Mm-hmm. Much less it doesn't work.
Right.
Even if it did, even if culling did work and you let those yearling bucks get to 5 years old, the odds are you're going to be absolutely thrilled with what they've got, what they ended up being. So anyway, my soapbox moment.
It's probably like diets. If everybody, and we talk about diets a lot, sure, and stuff, but it's a heck of a lot easier to think about, if I only ate these certain foods and this certain technique, I'm going to lose 20 pounds.
Right.
But the wildlife biologist person would probably that equivalent would come up and say, restrict some calories and get some exercise.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear that. I want some new diet that is, it's going to make it easy.
Yeah.
Because restricting calories and exercise stinks.
Yeah. I am definitely not the fad diet of biologist. Is what you're getting. Yeah. I am the restrict calories, work out more. Yeah, definitely. That's funny.
Yeah. But you got to put in the work.
Yeah, you got to put in the work. And guess what? At the end of the day, it's way more rewarding, and you get there fast. If you just stop shooting these young deer for whatever reason that somebody, and I don't care. Look, I'm going to be possibly politically incorrect here, but I don't care who told you. I don't care if it was your state biologist or your buddy at the bar to tell you to start culling. Stop. Yeah. Stop doing it. I'm here to stop the insanity. Was that one diet thing years back? So stop it.
You're going backwards.
Yeah, you're hurting yourself.
Yep.
You're hurting yourself. And let's not talk about breeding value. None of that matters at this big level. It's about moving numbers into older age classes. And inherently, you're going to be happier with antler development when it's 5 or 6 years old, or even 4, compared to that yearling age class. So and this is a big reason why we got into this study. Certainly, I hoped 13 years ago that it was going to work, because it would have been a vessel and an avenue for us to have bigger deer at a method that we're okay with, we're okay with doing. So, yeah, that would have been great if it worked. We would be swimming in big deer right now. It didn't. So, call the baby ugly if you want to, and it is what it is. So the lessons we learn from that are that we can, you don't get stressed out about any given buck for any time. And we look at bucks as both as a herd, how did this cohort, what did they develop under environmentally? And then we look at individuals. Do we think he can get bigger next year? Is he at the right age yet? Those things. But we never discuss, God, we got to get him out of here. If we don't get that guy out of here, and how many leases, how many properties, hunting camp, fire camps have you been around that somebody says, oh man, I got this POS, what that stands for, right? I got
get him out of the deer herd.
I got to get this guy out.
Yeah.
Look, standing, the wanted poster goes up into the camp, kill this SOB right now. We got to get him out before the breeding season.
Before he breeds.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
You hurry.
Mm-hmm.
It's nonsense. It doesn't matter. And that's liberating. That's the point. It's liberating. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, appreciate that exact deer for what he is. The odds are, if he's that big and kind of gnarly, or if he's that bothering you that much, it wouldn't surprise me if he ends up being a pretty heavy-bodied deer and mature. And I get a real sense of pride when I can bring in a 215-pound plus deer. I mean, we kill deer that are 260 pounds here, and that's pushing northern ranges.
Absolutely in your neck of the woods. That's astronomical.
Yeah. And that is, I get a lot of pleasure of that as a biologist coming up, because I've done everything I can as a biologist. And guess what? He was a 6 point, or maybe he was a 7 or something. He was a heavy, awesome deer. Awesome. I mean, probably anybody listening right now would have absolutely put him on the shelf and mount him or whatever. I mean, he's really cool. And 260 pounds. I mean, it looked like you should have put a saddle on him, but go for him.
Well, Donnie, I think we have the last nail has gone in the coffin on culling.
Okay.
At least from my perspective. There may be some other questions. We didn't talk about this or that, but I think we've covered it pretty thoroughly. And I want to tell you, thank you for doing this experiment.
Oh, well.
The rest of biologists, hunters, again, it's never been done before. I feel pretty confident, at least in my lifetime, it's never going to be done again at this scale. So this is a real contribution to science. So we all collectively appreciate it.
Yeah, you can't thank me. There's a lot more important people than me that worked harder and put more money into it. I'm just in a unique position and very privileged to be a part of it. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Donnie.
Thank you.
We're glad you joined us today and hope you learned something valuable about deer management. If you have questions about this podcast or a question about a topic we haven't discussed, please log on to msudeerlab.com, click on the Deer University tab, and send us your questions. We'll get to them as soon as possible. In closing, we want to thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. We also want to thank the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowments that support deer research and education.